Arthur Woods, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It is a pleasure. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you today. We're going to be talking about your book, Hiring for Diversity, The Guide to Building an Inclusive and Equitable Organization. Such a hugely important topic, very timely. And in fact, it's so timely that last week when we had originally scheduled this interview, we ended up just chatting in the pre-interview for far too long. So we had to reschedule to make sure we had time to actually do the interview itself, because there's just
That's a good sign.
so many interesting things going on right now. So many current events. So, there's just so much happening in the world, and this is relevant to all of it. So I'm super excited to be able to chat with you about this and learn more about your experiences and your insights around inclusivity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. As we get started, I wanted to share I wanted to share Arthur's bio with everybody. Arthur Woods is a social entrepreneur and LGBTQ+ advocate working at the intersection of equity, inclusion, and technology. He is an Amazon national bestselling author of the book Hiring for Diversity, and he is the co-founder and Matheson, a I am totally fumbling this. I'm going to start your bio over and I'll cut this out.
Yeah, no worries.
Arthur Woods is a social entrepreneur and LGBTQ+ advocate working at the intersection of equity, inclusion, and technology. He is an Amazon national bestselling author for the book Hiring for Diversity and the co-founder of Matheson, a venture-backed technology platform equipping employers with everything they need to manage their diversity hiring efforts. Arthur was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 and 40 Under 40 by BEQ. He is a 3-time TEDx speaker and has advised leading brands from Disney, Sonos, and MetLife to the Smithsonian. Again, a pleasure to have you, Arthur. Anything else you would like to share with me by way of your background, personal context, before we dive on in further?
No, John, I'm excited to be here and really excited to dive in. As you said, this is a topic that is very much top of mind for so many leaders right now. So I'm glad that we're getting some time to talk about it.
Yeah, excellent. Well, why don't you start by just giving us a little bit of background to the book?
Sure.
These books, a lot of iterations, and ultimately, why this book? Why now? Why is this something that you decided was necessary today?
Sure, John. So, for the last few years, I think we're all aware that diversity has risen to a very top priority for most organizations. We saw so many leaders this last couple of years identify that they had major gaps in representation. They started to acknowledge that something needed to change. And I found that many leaders had vastly different perceptions of what change was needed, what success fundamentally looks like. I would speak to leaders who had vastly different definitions of what diversity was itself. And everyone seemed to be getting, different recommendations and insights about what they should do. And there was a unanimous belief that not enough is being done. So seeing kind of the variance across the space, I saw the need to have an actionable and accessible playbook that could give leaders practical insights of how to go from intent to action around diversity. And we all know that there's a need, but I think most leaders are struggling with the how. They're not struggling with the why. So in speaking to hundreds of leaders, actually getting a chance to sit down with, dozens upon dozens of community leaders across different underrepresented groups, I was able to work with my co-author, Susanna, to build out basically a practical playbook. And this covers everything from how do we, fundamentally rethink what we mean by diversity? How do we write inclusive job descriptions and craft more accessible role requirements, all the way to the way that we interview, the way that we craft inclusive job offers, and that we activate diversity recruiting across our organization. And honestly, John, it became a labor of love, right? It really was this fascinating journey of collecting these insights, putting them in one place, and kind of learning from leaders how the insights land in terms of their organization.
Yeah, and the labor of love, I think, is something I hear commonly from those who are practitioners in the space and ultimately decide, a book is necessary. And certainly this one is. And you just highlighted a whole bunch of the subtopics that I think are essential as we're trying to hire for diversity and truly get beyond the diversity piece, not just getting people at the table, but now creating an inclusive environment, a culture of belonging where everyone feels truly valued, needed, wanted, the opportunity to contribute in meaningful ways. All of that is so important. But it starts with getting, having inclusive hiring efforts and focusing on the equity and diversity piece from the get-go. So we can dig into some of those specific areas that you just mentioned, because I think that'll be helpful for a lot of listeners. But I also just wanted to highlight from the outset that the why behind all of this, hopefully for most people, is pretty clear. But in case it's not, there's a clear business case for all of this. Organizations perform better. They have more creativity and innovation. Teams are more productive when you leverage effective diversity within organizations. But it's also the right thing to do from a human perspective. The human case coupled with the business case should make it a no-brainer that every organization wants to be paying attention to this and making sure that we're fostering a really wonderful environment where everyone feels valued. And when that happens, not only is it better for the individuals, it's better for the team, it's better for the organization as a whole.
Yeah, that's spot on. And to your point, we have to really kind of bring this back to the human case. The business case sometimes can disguise us from the core essence of what we're really trying to achieve. And if we get to the heart of DEI, the not kind of stigmatized and politicized view of it, it's, what are the conditions that we can create to unleash the potential of our teams? And if we think about the practical case of having a representative team that's reflective of the customers you're trying to serve, that fosters diversity of thought, that creates safety where people can raise their hand and make things better, those are the conditions. I don't know about you, John, but those are the conditions that I believe every single team, regardless of sort of their leaning politically, will thrive in. And I think, in fact, a lot of the recent events have created these kind of unnecessary headwinds for diversity, and it have created a bit of a stigmatized, kind of politicized view of it. That's created, I think, a sentiment among some to say, oh, we can kind of take our focus off of this, or actually this might even be more harmful than good for our organizations, therefore we shouldn't invest in it at all. We have to really kind of combat that.
Yeah. And everyone who's a longtime listener of the podcast, especially if you watch the videos, I'm a straight cisgender white dude, so I have all the layers of privilege, and I could potentially be one of those who could feel threatened by DEI efforts in organizations, because perhaps in some way that could threaten my position of power within organizations or whatever. But like you just said, I want this for me and the people around me. I think because I know it's going to make life better for me. I want people to be treated with dignity and respect, but I want to work for an organization like that. I want to work for an organization that values every individual contributor, that treats people well, that doesn't exploit people, that doesn't discriminate, etc. And regardless of your political leanings, or whatever your particular categories are, in terms of these different demographics, I think ultimately it's in everyone's best interest to create this kind of really fostering inclusive environment of belonging, so that everyone has an opportunity to achieve their potential and to thrive.
Yeah. John, I'm really glad that you called that out, and I appreciate the vulnerability of speaking to this subject from the lived experience and sort of identity of every person. I think what's fascinating about DEI work in general is that every single person has a different psychological relationship to it based on their identity and their lived experience. And to your point, some folks are threatened by it. I really love the the very vulnerable, open, cisgender white male allies that show up and say, I want to be part of the solution here, and I don't see this as a threat. I see that if we create a fair, equitable place for everyone, all the boats rise with the tides, right? And we need everyone around the table. I think there's been a perception that we should have allies kind of sit on the sidelines and not engage. Many, by the way, who are afraid of saying they're doing the wrong thing. And the sentiment of everyone's voice needing to be heard, and everyone's participation truly being necessary for the work to work. And I think in the context of hiring, there's a great example there. A lot of organizations that are homogenous to begin with have to activate those well-meaning allies who might not have taken much action if we want to see our processes change, if we want to see any of our recruiting efforts pay off, right? This is a lot of the hiring managers, by the way, that are in positions of authority, who frankly sometimes have been the culprits of bad behavior. We have to get them on board, and they, we have to ensure they're not breaking the rules, or they're not sort of veering away from the vision that the organization sets. Otherwise, I think we're not going to see a lot of progress. So I really am glad that you brought that component into the conversation.
Yeah, and to also highlight, you've referred to this, I've referred to this, but it's worth just noting again. At this point, we're talking about kind of the front end, right? Let's cast a wide net. Let's attract a diverse pool. Let's give everyone a truly equal, fair shake at getting hired into different positions. So we have diversity hiring, et cetera. Let's focus on all of that so we can have a good pipeline of great people coming to the organization. But it is important to note that just because you get those people into the organization doesn't mean that you've solved the issue.
You're absolutely right.
It's the first step, right? And from there, then you have to have that inclusive environment. You have to create a culture of belonging. And if you don't have, and you have to make sure that you rid the organization of inequitable, systems and practices, the policies, practices, and procedures that often persist, even unknowingly, to some people, that negatively impact the day-to-day lived experience of individuals when they go to the workforce. So you could do a really great job of doing all of this diversity hiring stuff really, really well, spot on. You get the great team to come, you make the good hires, but guess what? If it's not a great environment, those people aren't sticking around. They're going to leave. And
that's right.
So again, we're talking about the first step, but fully acknowledging that there are additional steps in this whole process.
That's 100% right. And I think a lot of organizations do see their primary critical path being the top of funnel sourcing. Let's just get these candidates in the door. And once we find these candidates, everything else will be solved. And to your point, not only do we have to think about the equity and accessibility and intention of our full process, our hiring process. And by the way, a lot of candidates face the most significant bias at the moment that a job description is crafted and it has these inaccessible requirements, or where so much bias comes up that I wrote about in the interview process, where I'm sure as you've seen, John, there's so much subjectivity because we've had a lot of senior leaders, frankly, that have interviewed in a pretty off the cuff improv manner since the beginning of time, right? So much inequity, shows up after the upfront sourcing. But to your point, John, a really clear point here that we have to be really intentional about how we're onboarding folks to set them up to be successful. We see drop off of underrepresented new hires within the first 90 days if they're not set up for success. And then to your point that folks are given autonomy, mobility, safe mechanisms to share feedback so that they're set up to be successful and to stay in advance once they're in the organization. That's truly half the battle.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. With all of that said, let's now drill down into a couple of these hiring practices that are the best practices to make sure that we aren't inadvertently, unintentionally perhaps narrowing, unnecessarily so, by the way, narrowing our potential pool of applicants and making sure that we are truly equal employment opportunity organizations, not in just name only, but truly in every sense of the word. One of the things you talked about, was just from the very inception of the position and the posting, as you're starting to craft the job posting, which is that initial very first step even send a signal out that you're interested, that you want to find people. What are some of the pitfalls that you've seen organizations fall into again and again around the job description and the posting that then goes out and can shape how people perceive the position and who's willing to even put their name forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is actually it's one of those issues that's in plain sight, and we oftentimes really overlook it. So if we think about the common way that a job description is crafted, right, from its genesis, it's oftentimes the case that you have a hiring manager who says, I want to hire for this role. The first thing I'm going to go do is I'm going to Google that job. I'm going to find the first job description that I find, and I'm going to just put that into a document, maybe add a couple, edits. Typically, I'm not reducing anything. There's no reduction there at all. And so what's happening is I'm literally, without a lot of thought, pulling through requirements that could have been literally written 20 years ago for that job rec. And actually, sometimes that's the way recruiters operate as well. So what happens in all of this, is that we're typically paying way too much. We're thinking in our head, I want to kind of imagine the perfect candidate, and this perfect candidate complex is something I try to talk a lot about, because in a perfect candidate world, right, we start to say, well, it'd be wonderful if they had a PhD. It'd be wonderful if they went to an Ivy League school, if they had a really high GPA. All of this sort of exorbitant industry experience. It'd be wonderful if they actually had more experience than we needed. And we could somehow get this deal on a really overqualified candidate for a role that we're going to pay them less for, right? And in our minds, we start to kind of create this archetype of the perfect candidate. And we put in these credentials into that archetype that are really unnecessary. What we're actually doing inadvertently is we're taking what could have been a very representative pool, and we're restricting it to a very homogenous pool. Because if we think about historically, the folks that have had these exorbitant credentials, they have not been very representative, right? So the tactic for hiring managers and for recruiters alike is to strip away anything that is like what we would call non-essential. And this takes actually quite a bit of energy, right? It's to think about, well, maybe I don't need, just as some examples, I don't need an advanced degree. Can I provide an alternate to a degree? Can there be years of experience that are commensurate to a degree, right? Can I eliminate ranges of years? A lot of job descriptions, as I'm sure you've seen, John, have 10 to 15 years, or these wide ranges. What has been statistically proven to happen is that an underrepresented candidate sees a range of years. If they come in at the bottom end of it, they're less likely to pursue that opportunity. And we found this especially among women. If women, statistically proven, don't tend to meet all the requirements for the job, it is less likely they will apply to that job than a man, right? So we see the inequities that already are created when we have these exorbitant requirements. So we really coach folks to strip away anything that's not necessary. Focus on competencies, not on years, not on degrees. And if we get focused on what you will actually do in this job and what you need to deliver to be successful, that's a much more equitable way to craft that role. And again, less is more.
Yeah, and just as an illustration to the point, years of experience, that's been one of my pet peeves for decades. Because what does it really tell you? I don't think it tells you what you think it tells you most of the time.
Right.
And one of the things that I often will say to leaders is, say it's even like 5 years of experience. Okay, what does that mean? 5 years of experience. Are you going to put someone forward as a better candidate because they have 5 years of crappy experience versus the one person who has, a year and is hungry and motivated and is a fast learner and is, they're going to come in and they're going to hit the ground running? Like, in what world would you say the person with 5 years is better for the position than that other person? I don't think most people would say that. Most people wouldn't say that when it's framed to them that way. Yet we're artificially creating that dynamic within the pool of candidates, and you're having people selecting. You're pushing them out of the pool, whether they're self-selecting out or you're signaling to them that they should, apply, or telling them that they shouldn't apply. And ultimately you end up with people who may be a good fit, but just as likely may not be, because that arbitrary years of experience doesn't really tell you much of anything meaningful.
That's exactly right.
and their ability to do the job well. And it can be the same thing with college degrees. Now, I'm a professor. I think college is important. I want people to go to college and get degrees and get certified and et cetera. And I think those will serve people well for the most part in their careers. But I'll be the first one to tell you that to just have an arbitrary requirement that you have to have a bachelor's degree for a position for no other reason than that's what you've always done, that doesn't make any sense, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And, I mean, these are two interesting statistics. The first is that we start to make our initial decisions about a candidate's suitability in 7 seconds of reading their profile. And the second is that in an interview, typically the interviewers decided within the first 15 minutes of the call whether the candidate is suitable for the role. So we're making really fast, snap decisions, typically very subjectively with a lot of bias. And it goes to show that, just as much as the candidate has to be able to sort of see this role and see if they're qualified, we have to be able to kind of rethink how we look at a candidate holistically, and we don't use these we would call essentially shorthand mechanism for deciding on a candidate suitability prematurely, right?
Yeah. And to your point about diverse pools, we are unnecessarily restricting the diversity, not just race, gender, those types of categories, but socioeconomic diversity. Like there's all sorts of things that feed into this, that we are unnecessarily narrowing the pool by having this tack on list of all these different requirements that may or may not be all that important to the ability for someone to perform well in the job. And so, I've heard it many times as I've talked to leaders, and they're dealing with diversity issues, and I'll say, hey, can I look at some of your recent job postings? And I'll look at them, and immediately I'm like, well, no wonder that your staff is like 90% white men. It's no wonder, because everything is designed in such a way to disproportionately elevate applicants from that population. And it's I point that out, and they're like, no, we're not racist, we're not sexist, we're giving everyone a fair shake. We're just putting in there what is necessary qualifications to be able to perform the job, and the only people that are qualified tend to be white men, and so it's not our fault. That's kind of the dialogue that I often hear, and I'm like, really, you think the only people qualified? And
well, right
go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's spot on, John. And this is where I think, recruiters, anyone that participates in the hiring process has a role to play in shifting that narrative. Because you're right, there are oftentimes leaders who feel very validated in their approach to say, I'm looking for someone with all of these very specific things, and it's typically the white man, right? And, we have a chance to kind of push back and say, what does it really mean to be successful in this role? And how can we overcome these preconceptions, right, and myths that we might have had about sort of what sets someone up for success. And we really need we refer to this concept of case studies. Case studies, have long stood the test of time in almost every space. But in inclusive hiring, case studies are the examples of sort of breaking the mold and the unconventional successes that actually kind of emerged from us, taking a different approach, opening up the pool, right? Rethinking requirements, taking a more structured approach. So I think the more that we have these case studies, they become kind of our currency to get this work to scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Arthur, this has just been a real pleasure. I know we've only scratched the surface, but you have a book that goes into great detail on all of these topics and related topics. As we wrap things up for today, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, where they can find your book, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Thank you, John. Well, I'm a partner at Plenty Search. We help early stage companies build their leadership teams. We have an amazing track record on diversity. So for companies that are hiring and trying to build their leadership teams inclusively, we enjoy partnering. You can learn more about us at plentysearch.com, and then hiring for diversity at hiringfordiversity.com. What I would end by saying is we really need everyone. typically this conversation, the diversity recruiting topic reaches audiences that I would call kind of the choir being preached to. And what I would sort of challenge the folks who are nodding their head in our dialogue, John, who are saying, yes, I know, it's yes, take this to the person that doesn't know, take this to the person that's pushed back and has honestly maybe been the bottleneck in this work taking off. And every single conversation is a chance for us to make progress, even plant a seed that will shift someone's perspective down the line. So I would say never overlook or take for granted the chance to shift the way that someone thinks about this work. We are definitely all making improvements together, and we're all in it together.
Yeah, well said. Arthur, it's been a pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Arthur can do for you, check out the book. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all